Now, before we engage in our debate, we just want to share 4 quick highlights from today's federal budget. For example, the government is going to be continuing with its 2-year stimulus plan introduced in the previous budget, pledging almost $20 billion for this year, but to end on time a year from now. The government says ending those stimulus measures on time will contribute to balancing the budget by 2016. That's 2 years later than projected in the last budget, however. They'll also slow the rate of spending growth next year for the military, freezing spending on foreign aid next year, reviewing government operations, including freezing salaries for federal officials. New economic measures designed to promote growth and job creation include lowering the corporate income tax from 18% to 15% by 2012 and making Canada a tariff-free zone for industrial manufacturers. And finally, one last point, a few new infrastructure measures introduced, including extending funding for First Nations water and sewage programs for more than 2 years. Okay, let's get into some analysis on this budget. Joining us now to debate from our nation's capital, Andrew Coyne, national editor and columnist from Maclean's magazine. Susan Delacourt, senior writer in the Parliamentary Bureau of the Toronto Star. Finn Poschmann, vice president of research at the C.D. Howe Institute. And Erin Weir, economist with the United Steelworkers Union. Okay, everybody, I want to first of all thank you for joining our discussion this evening. I also want to remind everybody watching us at home that this is a Your Agenda Thursday broadcast where you are part of the discussion, so you can reach us via Twitter at twitter.com/theagenda or by email at theagenda@tvo.org. Please jump in, join the debate. We'll put some of your comments up on the screen during the course of tonight's broadcast. And of course, as always, Mike Miner, our Fifth Column blogger, is hosting a live chat on our Inside Agenda blog. You'll find that on our homepage at tvo.org/theagenda, so you can log on there and join your fellow viewers and viewsers in that way too. Okay, let's start, Ottawa. Good evening, first of all, to everybody. Let's start with some analysis of the deficit and whether or not the move towards a balanced budget is happening quickly enough for your liking. The last time we had deficits this size, it was the old Paul Martin, I'm going to balance come hell or high water days. Do you get the sense, Andrew, to you first, that the current government is similarly exercised to find a way to balancing the books?
Well, no, but the situations aren't exactly parallel. We had come off 27 years in a row of running deficits in the past when Paul Martin was trying to wrestle it down. We'd accumulated enormous debts, much worse than we have now. So it's not as severe a situation as it is then. The thing we have to worry about is more looking forward. So we need to get into balance now, partly because you just should do so on principle, not run deficits too many times in a row, but also we've got a fiscal sort of tsunami coming at us in the form of the aging baby boom. And if we don't start coming to grips with that, both in the sense of getting control of spending, particularly healthcare spending, but also in terms of raising productivity, then we're going to be in a real pickle. And we should be, among other things, we should be starting to run surpluses as soon as we can in the short and near term, so that when the real bulge comes, the real hit comes, we'll be in a much stronger fiscal position to be able to deal with it.
Susan, does it look to you as if the government is as exercised as Mr. Martin was a decade ago? You wrote the book on him, after all, in getting those books balanced.
I wouldn't compare this to Paul Martin's budgets at all. I think I've been more reminded of the budgets of the past Conservative governments, of Brian Mulroney, and when they kept saying, we're going to do something about the deficit someday. And it was only when Paul Martin, and remember, the Liberals went through a budget themselves when they first came in 1993-94, a disastrous one, I think Andrew will remember, where they did the same thing. We're going to put it off. So I'm more reminded of 20 years ago than anything that Paul Martin did. And both in the lead up to this budget, the government didn't do anything to prepare the ground for tough measures, as we saw back in 1994-95 with the Liberals. I think this budget has a lot more to do with 2011. I think this is sort of a preview, and I'm sure they don't wish their own defeat, but I think they wouldn't mind if the Liberals were around again to clean up after them.
So this is aimed, you think, at sort of laying the groundwork for the end of this Parliament, a new election, and presumably they'd like a majority government.
Yeah, this is a minority government budget.
Gotcha. Finn, what's your view on that?
Absolutely. It's a political document. There's no question, Steve, that if the government had wanted to and had laid the groundwork for it, the deficit could be brought down to zero a lot sooner. look, the recession is for the most part behind us, so additional spending, new infrastructure spending looking out to 2011 doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense. We've got political commitments. The minister had made political commitments to current spending plans, made political commitments to balancing the budget over a multi-year phase or framework. That's something that's aimed at sailing through Parliament while attracting relatively little opposition, so it ain't pretty, but it'll work.
Erin, your view on getting to a balanced budget? It's actually not totally in balance. They're still projecting a very minor deficit of just over $1 billion 6 years out, but what's your view on the path to getting there?
Well, when consumers reduce their spending and businesses reduce their investment and Canada's trade balance turns negative, the only way to stabilize the economy is for the government to ramp up its spending and investments. So I think it's entirely reasonable and appropriate to run stimulative deficits in the short term. I would agree with the other panelists that we need to reduce the deficit in the longer term. And what I found troubling about Finance Minister Flaherty's interview was that he completely ruled out the possibility of reversing any of his tax cuts. If we're serious about balancing the budget in the long run, we need to get federal revenues back on some kind of a sustainable footing. Yet, as you mentioned in your summary of the budget, the government is going ahead and further cutting corporate income tax rates in the face of this deficit.
Although at the same time, Andrew, they are saying they're going to increase some payroll taxes as well. So is it a case of the government, takes with one hand, gives away with the other?
Well, first of all, there's no shortage of revenues. Revenues are in this budget are forecast to grow at nearly 7% per year. Let's hope that that's true, if they're not just indulging in rosy scenarios. So the notion that we're suffering from a shortage of revenues is ridiculous. If you're talking about the EI increases, that gets into real theology about to what extent is EI supposed to be self-financing, to what extent is it independent from government. And I'm not sure. I think I'm kind of agnostic on all those things. The main point is I do agree with the minister that raising taxes is the easy way out. There are lots of ways in which you could cut spending. It wouldn't require draconian cuts, a la Paul Martin. What's actually required is actually quite modest cuts. I might go a little deeper than Finn would, but not a huge amounts. The problem with this budget is there really aren't any cuts at all. Last September in the fiscal update, they projected that the total spending over the next 5 years would be $1.247 trillion. The budget projected it being $1.245 trillion. Total spending cuts over 5 years in this budget is $2 billion. That's $400 million a year on a budget of $250 billion. That's like, what, less than 0.2%. So to call this draconian, or I think the minister was telling the reporters today that it was a tough budget, it's a bit hard to take.
Well, everything's relative. Finn, the last few budgets that he's brought in have all increased spending by, I think, about 6-7% a year. So if spending only goes up 3% in this one, maybe that's draconian for them.
Yeah, well, that's about as positive a story as you can tell on the spending side. Look, there aren't any tough decisions in the budget. This is a very, very safe budget politically. There's no risk-taking on as far as, say, making potential enemies go. Realistically, looking out past 2014, you'd want to see the federal government restricting transfers to the provinces for health and social services. Those are things that provinces should be spending. Some messaging on that front would have been very useful. The minister and the government of the day did not want to make any enemies, did not want to attract any serious opposition to the budget this round. So we don't see a lot of those tough decisions. We do see very modest spending restraint, but I'll give them credit. The messaging is there. If we need more spending restraint sooner, that is something that the government is positioned to deliver, and there's lots of easy stuff they can do.
Susan, it's always a bit cheeky to quote a competitor, but here's Jeffrey Simpson on this, and the reason I'm putting it to you is because he does talk about the Paul Martin years, and you did write that book, Juggernaut, on how Mr. Martin did what he did. So let me read this quote and then get you to comment. Something quite remarkable happened to Canadians in the mid-1990s. Very swiftly, after years of delay and denial, the majority of Canadians accepted and even welcomed the elimination of deficits and the lowering of debt, which begs the question, why did it take so long? 20 years of deficits and accumulating debt for the public to wake up to the problem. The answer is that deficits and debts are insidious. They don't arrive overnight. They build up over time until danger points are reached, which are pointed to by negative developments in the economy, negative perceptions in international markets, and eventually in the daily lives of citizens. Canadians, once converted, absorbed the convictions of the converted and became inoculated against deficits. until the current recession, whose severity has shaken their conviction. It is vital, Jeffrey writes, however, that we not lose that conviction, that we park it somewhere, and that we do not slide back into those ugly years where excuses abounded for not doing anything serious. There were always people in the deficit years, mostly politicians, who said that cutting spending, suspending programs, or raising taxes was inopportune, that maybe someday something should be done, but certainly not now. So I want to go back at you on this. I know that you say that the circumstances are not quite the same as they were in the middle 90s to what we have today, but are there lessons from that period? We're about to go, hundreds of billions, potentially more in debt over the course of this financial meltdown. Are there lessons that we should have learned in the 1990s that you're concerned we're not learning today?
Well, I think you have to separate it into citizens, and what Jeffrey, I think, is talking about is the populace. And I think that's a whole other discussion about what the public is willing to take now. But I think it's a good chance to talk about the opposition parties. And remember, the Liberals back in the 90s were pushed by the conservative opposition. It was then called the Reform Party. But they had a very strong opposition pushing them toward this. This government does not have that. In fact, this whole budget day has felt to me like everybody's motto is not ready. Nobody's ready to do anything. The government isn't ready to come to grips with the fiscal situation. And the Liberals themselves, they could have got away with murder here because the Liberals have been telegraphing for weeks now, we're going to basically let you away with anything because we're not ready for an election. I don't think the Liberals wanted them to do cuts. That's not been the way they've been moving. They wanted something innovative and something on the lines of jobs. But I do think that what the Conservatives lack here is what the Liberals had in the 1990s, was an opposition pushing them to be tough.
Yeah, Finn, you want to follow up on that? That's a good point, because certainly all of the opposition today comes from spend more, spend more, spend more, whereas back in the day it was get those books balanced as soon as you possibly can. Different dynamic out there, isn't there?
Sure. There was also a bit of a public consensus around the importance of balancing the books at the time, which right now has not been exactly common across the land. Going back to late 2008, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister came out and said, look, the world now we see is safe for deficits. We're going to run deficits for a while. That's what the marketplace is calling for. In retrospect, I'd say probably they went a lot farther than they had to do, and that means that there's going to be some important messaging that has to be sort of corrected or rephrased in order to get us back to a platform where the public's ready for more restraint. The good thing about this budget is that at least there is some of that talk, there is some indication that the Finance Minister takes this seriously, that in a way that you certainly did not see, say, in the late 1980s, early 1990s.
Erin, where do you think the public is on the speed with which we need to balance the books right now?
Well, it's very difficult to say. I mean, a lot of public opinion polling will show that most people want lower taxes and also that most people want more government services. So, there's some different directions that you can take on that, but on balance, I think most ordinary Canadians are much more concerned about the job market than they are about the government's deficit. I mean, the worst feature of this economic crisis was that about 500,000 Canadians were laid off. And fewer than half of all the officially unemployed Canadians have received employment insurance benefits. So I think the priority really needs to be to get Canadians back to work and also to help out the Canadians who are unemployed through no fault of their own, even if that does involve running a somewhat larger deficit in the short term.
Okay, that's a good segue for us to broaden our discussion now from deficits, although I'm sure Andrew would love to have at you on that. We need a potentially bigger deficit right now, but hold off, Andrew, because...
Well, I'd like to have him on some points, too.
Okay, it's coming. It's coming. I do want to put this budget, though, into a broader economic context, because this is the second budget that this Conservative government has brought down since the recession and the financial community collapse, if I can put it that way, the global economic downturn. And Andrew, start us off on this. How well do you think the government has guided the broader economic ship of state over the past couple of years during these bad economic times?
Well, outside of the fiscal situation, I think they've done quite well. I think they handled the immediate crisis in the fall of '08 extremely well, actually. I give them very high marks for that. I think they did just enough and not too much in terms of supporting the financial sector. You didn't want to send signals that there was weakness here that there wasn't. On the other hand, you had to do something to show that you were part of the international effort on this. And I think they handled that extremely well. I think the central bank responded appropriately, the Bank of Canada, by flooding the market with liquidity, by providing, keeping interest rates extremely low. And in fact, if you want to know why we're experiencing the recovery, it has much more to do with those two things than with the fiscal situation. The economy had already started to recover before there were any shovels hitting the ground. This sort of sudden latter-day policy panic, as I put it, that happened in the fall of '08, where people suddenly revived Keynes because they thought, well, monetary policy isn't going to work here, before monetary policy had really even been applied. And as I think we have seen around the world, that monetary policy is, in fact, the sufficient and necessary ingredient in this situation. We didn't need to plunge into these deficits. If you want the proof of that, look at Flaherty's November update. This was in the middle of the economic crisis. So if he was showing, possibly fraudulently, but was showing a balanced budget. The notion that, well, we were wise and farsighted and we realized we had to run deficits to counter this economic crisis. It had a lot more to do with A, fear of losing their parliamentary, being voted down in Parliament.
The life of their government, yeah.
And B, once they made that decision, started spending, they found they rather enjoyed it. And you see all these, photo ops and ribbon cuttings and novelty checks being unveiled. And they've kind of corrupted themselves, I think, in this regard.
But Susan, the explanation was we're part of the G7, we're part of the G8. This is what all of the countries have agreed to do. Everybody else inflated, we inflated too, and we're part of the gang, so that's what they had to do. Given that core, could they have done anything different if that's what everybody in the G7 was doing?
I agree with Andrew, though. They seem to be enjoying it a lot. I think the spectacle of those novelty checks is going to stay with me for quite some time. And it fits as well with the way they work electorally. They segment the market for themselves and try to buy things here and there. Again, that goes to the point of the not ready thing. I had thought during prorogation, call me a naive romantic, that something would happen to change the political dynamic here, which is awful, right? It may look nice today because it's all pomp and ceremony, but you guys are all going to pull out of town and leave me here to deal with this stuff again, and nothing has changed. We've got the Conservatives doing a little bit here, a little bit there, running around with their big novelty checks. We've got the Liberals now put on the spot again and accused of propping up the government when they were called, they'll be called chicken today. They were called, I guess, opportunists in the fall. And we've got the NDP and Bloc deciding not to support the government and paying no political price for that whatsoever. To me, there's a Groundhoggish Day feeling around here that this has been 5 budgets and it's the same dynamic. And I think it takes more than just the Conservatives to do it. But I had been hoping that prorogation was going to change things.
How can you have been in Ottawa this long and still think that you're a naive romantic? That's what I really want to know.
It's the only thing that keeps me here.
Okay. Erin, let me get you on this. The size of the stimulus package. You've heard Andrew say before we didn't need to do it. You heard the government today, Mr. Flaherty, in his speech, boasting about the fact there were 16,000, I think he said, different programs out there as part of the economic action plan, as the government called it. Enough stimulus? Too much stimulus? Just about right? Where would you put it?
Well, I'd actually vote for more stimulus. I mean, I think certainly the package that has been put out there supported a significant number of jobs in the Canadian economy. But despite that, the budget envisions actually a higher unemployment rate this year than last year. So I think we actually need more stimulus to get Canadians back to work. And in particular, I think we need more money on employment insurance to help those Canadians who don't have jobs.
Finn, can I get your view on that?
Well, Erin's right that EI is a program that hasn't been working terribly well and needs an overhaul. But that's a longer-term project. It certainly isn't something that the government was going to address in any serious way in this round. I do want to take a moment, though, to say something a little bit kind about the longer-term economic impact of the trajectory the government has been on the tax front, and it's continuing a plan laid out by the previous government that does see lower tax rates on on corporate income, lower tax rates for individuals. We've got sales tax reform coming in Ontario and in BC that are important changes. We've got the elimination of tariffs on machinery and equipment and other business inputs. We are seeing an emergent Canada as a low-tax jurisdiction. This is big. This is important. It's very positive for investment and growth. It's very positive for jobs and incomes. This is a good news story. The government has been able to stick with that, and they deserve some respect for it. There's, as we said, there's a lot of sort of unnecessary stuff going on the spending side. But you've got to give them credit for sticking to a plan that does see a very positive outcome on the investment environment for Canada, and that does well for a lot of us.
Erin, I want to go right back to you on this because Mr. Flaherty also in his budget speech today, you can tell it is a huge deal for him to be the lowest corporate tax jurisdiction in the G7. He's proud of what he sees as his ability to get this country there. Why don't you share his pride over that?
Well, I don't think there's any evidence that the corporate tax cuts that have been enacted so far have actually increased investment as Finn claims. I mean, the Paul Martin government cut corporate taxes starting in 2000 when the federal rate was above 29%, down to 18% this year. And there was no increase of business investment as a share of the economy since 2000, even before the economic crisis. I think another really important thing that a lot of people don't understand about corporate taxes is that when an American company repatriates profits from Canada to the United States, it is subject to the U.S. federal corporate income tax rate on those profits, minus whatever taxes it's already paid in Canada. So as long as Canada's combined federal provincial taxes are at least as high as the American rate, there's no problem, and these U.S. companies don't owe any American tax on their Canadian profits. Now, though, that Ottawa and the provinces are slashing their corporate tax rates far below the American rate, that won't actually give money to business operations owned by American companies in Canada. It'll just force those corporations to pay the difference back to the U.S. Treasury. So the Canadian government is really giving up revenue for no good purpose. I guess they're helping out the American government, but that's about it.
Andrew, in which case do you think it is not a valuable goal of Mr. Flaherty's to try to have the lowest corporate tax rates in the G7?
Well, I'm less interested in the comparison between countries' rates. That's interesting, and you can kind of brag about it. I'm more interested in the absolute level of the corporate tax rates, or indeed tax rates in general. And that's just, frankly, a matter of arithmetic. The higher the tax rate that you have, the higher the pre-tax rate of return has to be able to deliver the kind of return after tax that's going to induce you to make investments. Supposing you need 10% rate of return, for example, to make that investment. If the tax rate's 50%, then you're going to need 20% before tax to make the investment. You cut that tax rate to 33%, you only need a 15% rate of return. So all those investments that might have been economic, under a 33% tax rate become economic now. So, that's why you want to bring tax rates down, is you want to lower that wedge between the pre-tax and after-tax rate of returns. It's nothing to do with, it's interesting, as I say, to be competitive in other countries, and it probably has some effects on location decisions at the margin, but I think that comparison is sometimes overblown.
And Steve, can we just have a moment for applause here? Because Mr. Coyne just gave the best, clearest, shortest explanation of the effective tax rate on new business investment I've ever heard, and he did a really good job.
You guys want to switch jobs tonight? Andrew, you go work for C.D. Howe. We'll put Finn over at Maclean's tonight. Susan, let me bring you in on this because, again, calling on your knowledge of the 1990s and the time you spent with Paul Martin.
I hope not tax rates.
No, we won't talk tax rates. I'm going to go for this, though. This government has, of course, boasted a great deal about how much better off we're doing than other countries in the G7, and frankly, all around the world. We weathered the recession better, our financial institutions held up better, our regulations, in hindsight, are now considered so much better than everybody else's. What I want to know is, how much credit can they claim for that, and how much of that did they inherit?
I think a large part of that was inherited, of course, and but that's not unusual that governments would claim credit for previous governments. The Liberal government got to do a lot of the things it did because Brian Mulroney brought in the GST. So it's not unusual, but they have been a little bit shameless about it, going around boasting that the banks, the secure banks, were their idea. I think what's probably useful, what you can give them credit for, is consistency. And I think there was, a couple of years ago, there was a story much overlooked by then Tom Flanagan didn't speak out as much as he does now. It was one of those at the time, rare bits of candor, where he said that he was glad that the government was spending itself into the ground because it was destroying the possibility of creating any more new programs in Ottawa. It was all toward a smaller Ottawa. And I think that's been the intriguing feature of all this stimulus spending, the novelty checks. It is like being a little bit like the carnival. They're spending this money and it's going to be gone. It's not like they're creating any new infrastructure for Ottawa or any new role for the federal government or any lasting impression of themselves here. It is sort of the incredible shrinking Ottawa in all of this, despite Andrew's concerns about spending. But it really is, it does have a hint of recklessness about the way they're doing it, because it doesn't buy them anything. It doesn't buy them anything for the future. And once they're gone, Canadians will not have anything to show for it.
They're saving the village to destroy it. But I don't know. I'm sure that might be part of Tom Flanagan's thinking. But as a cunning plan, I'm not sure it's working out, because even in 2015, so 6 years after the recession, and after these supposed spending cuts, by their own budget's reckoning, they'll be spending 13.2% of GDP in program spending. That's more than the Liberals were in 2006. So after all this, we're going to raise up spending so we can lay waste to Ottawa. They will actually have a larger Ottawa relative to the economy than the Liberals left them.
Erin, you want to go for that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, 13.2% of GDP is not a high level of federal program expenditure. I mean, you're right, it is a percentage point higher than what the Liberals spent. But if you go back before that, it's really the lowest level of federal program spending that we've seen since the early 1950s. So I would argue that the federal government's actually spending too little and really needs to invest more in a lot of infrastructure and public programs. Similarly, on the revenue side, if you look at that as a percentage of gross domestic product, today's budget was boasting about the fact that it's at the lowest level since 1961. So I think that kind of counters Andrew's point about there not being any shortage of revenue.
Well, now I'm regretting raising percent of GDP, because that is the favorite measure of people who want to expand the state, because as long as spending doesn't grow faster than the economy, you can say it hasn't grown at all. I much prefer, and which is ridiculous, because it basically says spending should always go up, not because it needs to, but just because it can. I much prefer the measure of real dollars, that is inflation-adjusted dollars per citizen. And we are now spending real dollars per citizen 50% more than we did a decade ago. Have you got 50% more services than you had a decade ago? No, you do not. So that's, I think, a much better measure of how much spending has already grown, which now the government proposes to freeze it for a couple of years at that extraordinary level, which does not count as restraint to me.
In which case, Finn, if you are a genuine small C conservative in this country, and there are a few, are you disappointed by the fact that it seems as if this big C conservative government has kind of embraced, big spending ways?
It's a good question, Steve. Look, this, as I said early on, is really an issue of some economic dreams meet hard political reality in a minority parliament. It's not pretty. When governments, when political parties come into power, they adopt policies that are likely to sustain themselves in power until it's time for things to change. So there's been a lot of sort of to and fro on the part of the government as to where a real agenda is. Is there really a conservative fiscal program? If you looked at spending, as Andrew says, you would not detect it. But if, as I said before, though, if you look at the overall long-run tax program, there is a sound program there. There is something that's very well aimed at making Canada a strong economy, a model for very much a model for Western economies, a liberalizing model, one that speaks out in favor of trade. These are good things, and I will give him credit for that.
Well, indeed. Thanks for the segue again, because we played a couple of clips of Mr. Flaherty already from his budget speech, and I had another queued up ready to go, and it's pretty much right on what you just said. So, if we would, control room, roll tape, please.
We are giving Canadian businesses the freedom to invest and innovate, to grow and create jobs. We are helping Canadian workers get the skills they need to thrive in the global economy. We are building the modern infrastructure on which the jobs of the future will depend. We are maintaining the sound regulation needed for stability and growth. We are building Canada's reputation as an investment-friendly country, a country committed to free and open trade, unburdened by the massive debts and higher taxes of our competitors. We are shaping an economy that will create more good jobs and a higher quality of life for all Canadians.
Okay, Susan, we know it's his job to put the best shine possible on what the government is doing, but you heard that list of what he perceives to be his accomplishments. How much of that is true in your view?
I never thought I'd be asked whether a politician was speaking. They're always speaking the truth. I'm
that romantic in you?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I'm sure he thinks it's true. Budget speeches aren't about sort of what's true or false. It's about sort of putting the spin on things. I'm not that. I don't think he's going to be measured against this. In fact, I'm predicting that we're not going to be talking about this budget in about a week or two.
Why not?
One is just because I don't know that there's a lot in this budget to talk about. And two is an interesting cultural, sociological fact that goes to what we have been talking about, is the institutional memory of Ottawa now is about a week. And no, seriously, it's it is amazing how much can be forgotten in a month or two here. And we just keep drifting on and on and on. And I say this because I think it also helps explain what we talked about at the outset, is that it is very hard to get the public and mold public opinion around something that requires something in long-term installments, like the idea of tackling the deficit. You can't get the public's attention anymore. It may be the fragmented media. I'm sure there are people out there doing theses about this right now. But I do think that a friend of mine who actually worked around Martin back in the days of the hell or high water budget said that that couldn't happen in the current media climate. You just couldn't count on the media to have an evolving narrative anymore. It's very episodic. It changes day to day. So we get a lot of words, but seriously, they will be forgotten a week from now. That's the not naive and romantic side of me.
I'm glad that person still exists too. Stand down, everybody, for a second, because we've got Mike Miner in an undisclosed location in the basement of 2180 Yonge Street here in Midtown Toronto, and he is monitoring the online chat that we're having on tvo.org/theagenda tonight. Mike, come on in here and tell us what folks are saying.
Well, Steve, they're really agreeing with Susan on this. They're talking about the budget in a way that implies that deficits wasn't a big concern for them. They were looking for specific things to help out their situation. They weren't deeply concerned that Canada's financial ship was headed in the wrong direction. Kaleem, who's a regular, writes in saying he was looking for more broadly distributed support for knowledge economy, startups, education, and training. Sarah from Nipigon wanted to see more regional issues addressed, and she wanted to see how new programs and spending would help her region. And Ken in Toronto is frustrated with his own economic situation. He was hoping to see some information coming out of Ottawa today to imply that, you know, he might get the help he's needed. He's been self-employed for 16 years. He's being forced to close his business and wants to retrain, but he has to do it out of his own pocket because he doesn't qualify for any of the government programs to retrain. So the bigger narrative just washed right over pretty much everyone who's talking in the chat tonight. And we have around 40 people at the moment, and more people in and out all the time. So generally, they're all agreeing with what Susan just said.
Okay, Mike, we'll check back with you later in the program. Thanks for that update tonight. Once again, Mike is monitoring this online chat at tvo.org/theagenda. Dial us up and chime on in. Andrew, let me follow up with something Mike just said there, because the Conservatives did, lay a lot of hints out in the last few days that this budget was going to deliver big time on innovation and on the knowledge economy. Did they?
No, I'm not sure how much hinting they were doing in that regard. But just to address some of those comments, I think what people should bear in mind about all those things is, as important as those sort of micro things are, the big picture is also important. If you don't keep your debts under control, you get eaten alive. At the height of our deficit madness in the 80s and 90s, we were spending 37 cents out of every tax dollar just to pay interest on the debt. So anything else you might want to do with that dollar in terms of healthcare, in terms of innovation, in terms of helping people get jobs, what have you, gets put aside. You're simply, you know, running faster and faster on the treadmill just to pay off your creditors. So the notion that there's a conflict between the two, that if you're paying attention to the deficit, that somehow you're ignoring these other concerns, I think really should be set to one side. You have to control the overall situation to be able to attend to some of those more selective concerns. The other thing I want to say was about the speech the minister gave is I actually think there is some truth in it. I want to say some nice things about them for once. That I do think they've been doing some very interesting things. This might make Erin's head explode, but on the free trade front, free trade with Europe, free trade with India, some of these smaller treaties they're signing, I think that's a very exciting agenda. I agree with Finn in terms of the tax cuts. There is a, you know, bit by bit, incrementally, hither and yon, there is a kind of a larger vision that does start to emerge over time from these guys. As I say, they sort of take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But that stuff's very exciting. The only thing I was dismayed to see missing from the throne speech in particular was talking about the economic union and enforcing free trade within our own country. And at one time in the 2007 throne speech and in subsequent documents, including their election platform the last time out, they were talking very tough about we're getting serious about this, we're giving the provinces notice, get rid of your interprovincial trade barriers by 2010 or we're bringing the hammer down in the form of the federal trade and commerce power. And we get to a throne speech and a budget, they're all supposedly all about productivity and competitiveness and trade, and there's no mention of it. And I was sorry to see that. And
Finn, that's in quite distinction to the plans internationally, where Mr. Flaherty pointed out he wants his country to be a tariff-free zone, but apparently not within the country. Is that right?
Well, it's not quite right. There is an internal trade agreement. It does have a new chapter that will be tested in the coming while. It is unfortunate that a number of provinces have listed exemptions for specific trades with respect to cross-border mobility. That's something that the provinces are going to over time, we hope, or we should hope, change their views on. But Andrew's right. There's no new rhetoric about the exercise of federal power in this range. It is a minor disappointment, but I'd say only minor because there has been some evolution on this front in the past year, and there are some changes that do need time to play out.
Erin, you want to respond to that?
Well, I do. I mean, I actually don't think there's a lot of evidence that interprovincial trade barriers even exist. I mean, the MacDonald Royal Commission studied this a couple of decades ago and concluded that interprovincial trade barriers cost the equivalent of 0.05% of gross domestic product, so 1/20th of 1% of the economy. And since then, most of the specific interprovincial trade barriers that existed have been done away with. I mean, the classic example that people always used to like to whine about was the fact that in Quebec, you couldn't sell margarine that was colored to look like butter. Well, the government of Quebec got rid of that. So, I mean, I'd actually challenge Andrew or Finn to sort of name 5 interprovincial trade barriers.
Okay,
let me ask you a couple of questions then. Presumably the Trade, Investment and Labour Mobility Agreement between BC and Alberta then made no difference at all. It didn't change anything if there are no trade barriers between provinces, in which case, second question would be, why is Labour fighting the Trade, Investment and Labour Mobility Agreement? Why are they fighting to prevent it from being extended to Saskatchewan? If it doesn't make any difference, if it's not going to change anything, you presumably have nothing to worry about.
Well, I'm quite proud to have been directly involved in fighting to prevent that agreement from being extended to Saskatchewan, and the reason I did so is that the agreement sets up these sort of secretive commercial tribunals that meet behind closed doors that give business the ability to challenge any government policy that's perceived to in some way possibly impair some potential investment opportunity.
So it gives a trade barrier, in other words.
Well, no, that's not that's well, I mean that's not a trade barrier or an investment barrier. It's something that gives business the ability to sort of harass public policy, and it's also going to have a chilling effect on regulators because, you know, nobody wants to strengthen a standard or make a decision that runs the risk of their provincial government getting sued for up to $5 million. So, I mean, Tilma was like trying to kill a fly with a sledgehammer. It was this legalistic approach that applied to everything. You know, when what we should have had was a case-by-case approach where somebody came up with a list of the interprovincial trade barriers that exist, which I haven't seen, by the way, and came up with some specific solutions to them.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is where the moderator comes back in and says, well, this is all fascinating.
Especially in Saskatchewan.
Especially in Saskatchewan, whereas we all know we have millions of viewers. With 5 minutes to go, we've managed to keep the discussion at a very lofty and intellectual level, but I want to get in the gutter for a while and just talk some crass politics, because I wonder, in a minority parliament, Susan, to you first, you know, Jim Flaherty said in his interview with me at the top of the program that he spent much of the time, his definition of recalibrating during the prorogation period was to say no a lot. No to all the people on all sides of the House that wanted him to spend more money. How hard is it for a government in a minority government situation to stay alive if it wants to say no all the time?
Oh, well, the interesting thing is that Mr. Harper has had no trouble saying no to the people who supported him. It's been one of the quirky little things around him that that he says no to his cabinet ministers when they want to speak. He says no to his caucus when they want anything. He says no to his Conservative base when they ask him to rein in spending. I actually wrote that down when I heard that too. I thought, that's very odd. How did you know back in December that you were going to have to spend all this time saying no? Like, it just seemed like a news story to me. I don't think that we're going to hear Mr. Harper saying no a lot. I think another intriguing thing that people haven't noticed is that Mr. Harper has effectively stopped speaking in the last 6 months. He makes speeches here and there, and he says, you know, he appears at things and he sends, yes, he plays the piano and sends photos to us. But Mr. Harper as the tough guy in this, I don't see it.
Andrew, how about you on that?
Well, $250 billion a year is a lot of yes. So granted, they said no to some people, but it's a fairly lame defense of the budget that it could have been worse. Think of how much more we might have spent. I mean, there's a lot of pages in the budget that say, compared to the basket cases around the world who went even deeper into stimulus, United States, Britain, Greece, we're looking pretty good. Well, yeah, okay, but surely we can measure ourselves by a better yardstick than that. No, it's a little too easy to blame it on the opposition to say the Liberals made us do it, the NDP made us do it. I think Susan's point was well taken, particularly with this budget. The opposition was screaming, we don't want an election. They could have pushed much further on this than they did, and I think they made their own choices.
Finn, what about that? Should they have said no much more and much more harshly?
Well, the truth is they could have, and chose not to. The reasons for saying not to, I think, you know, do, notwithstanding what Andrew said, have something to do with minority politics. They do have something to do with how the government will be perceived in the provinces, in Quebec in particular. It does have something to do with the government's positioning for the next election in 2011. So politics certainly are at play. This is a government that would not expect to do well in an election, taking a hard ideological stand, and therefore has not taken a hard ideological stand with respect to, say, carving out a Conservative fiscal platform. It's a decision that they've simply elected not to make.
Erin, you want a quick word on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's true that, you know, taking that hard ideological stand would hurt them politically, but, you know, that's why we live in a democracy. And I think the comments from a lot of your bloggers reflect the fact that people aren't concerned about balancing the budget as quickly as possible. They're concerned about government doing things to actually improve their lives. So, you know, I think that it's reasonable to kind of continue the stimulus spending until the economy recovers and think about other things we can do collectively to improve our lives.
Okay, I got a minute left here. Let me give 30 seconds to Andrew and 30 seconds to Susan. Susan, you first on this. Michael Ignatieff says he doesn't like the budget, but he's not going to vote the government down over this. Do you lose face when you say this stinks, but I'm voting for it anyway?
I say this with no partisan sentiments at all. I hope not, because I am so sick of that story. I am just tired of the you are chicken if you decide not to have an election. It is the most boring 5-year-old story here in Ottawa, and a new one would be most welcome.
Andrew?
I completely agree. I would only say I think the Liberals got themselves into that fix in the first place. He is now doing what he should have done when he first took over the leadership, which is to say, don't ask me that question. I'm going to spend the next 2 years creating a credible government in waiting, raising money, developing policy, recruiting candidates. That's what people want. He's now saying that. He's having a hard time making himself heard above, as Susan says, the din of reporters demanding to know that. I think he did the right thing. I think people should lay off on that.
So why don't, Susan, you guys in Ottawa just sort of cut him some slack and stop asking him that question every 5 minutes?
As it's Groundhog Day here.
Oh, right, okay, I forgot. I forgot how it works. Okay, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight in our Ottawa studios to help us understand and analyze this budget much better than we did 60 minutes ago, if you don't mind my saying. Andrew Coyne from Maclean's Magazine, Susan Delacourt from the Toronto Star, Finn Poschmann from the C.D. Howe Institute, Erin Weir, United Steelworkers of America, up here in Canada, of course. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Steve.